Hey guys, thanks for watching right here on the CB vlog. If you want, go ahead and hit subscribe if you're liking these videos and these topics of discussion. But without further ado, let's get to this week's topic.
Okay, so one topic that you hear thrown around a lot is the idea of magical Christmas land. We want to talk about that for a couple of seconds. How it influences brewing decks, what it means, plain and simple, and how we can use that idea as inspiration to keep decks going and to get new ideas for decks. So first of all, what do we mean when we say magical Christmas land? I think most of the time it's when we see a new card and we construct a scenario where it's doing crazy things. But in reality, the likelihood of that happening is very slim because it requires a very specific board state. It requires our opponents not to interfere. It requires a lot of different things. So we call that magical Christmas land because it might only happen once a year.
Yeah, it's a best case scenario, right? Like I have my enchantment, I have this artifact, I've got these cards in my hand. It's like, okay, well, you're setting up a very specific thing, and what's the likelihood really of that actually happening?
And I want to say that I think there's a difference between magical Christmas lands and combos, right? I think sometimes a combo means I get these 3 cards and I win. But magical Christmas land takes a card that already does things and just does it way more than that. It just like amps it up to a 10 out of 10, whereas normally the card might be a 5 out of 5. I think that's a lot of times the way people use magical Christmas land.
Yeah, and I think the reason for that, like the reason I think that makes it even more into like the Christmas land thing is because it, like you said, taking a card that's maybe just average, and then you're describing the very slim like window where it is amazing, right? Where it turns into a 10, like you're saying. And whereas the reason like that doesn't really happen for cards that are already 8s, 9s, or 10s or whatever is because they don't need a magical Christmas land to be good. Whereas these other cards, they might actually need all this support to make them that good.
Yeah, I mean, I know we didn't like plan out cards to talk about or anything, but one card came to my mind, Andy. I'd love your opinion on it. How do you feel Helm of the Host fits into Magical Christmas Land? Is that a card that it itself is just a Magical Christmas Land on its own? Or how does that play into it? Because I've heard people use the term with that card.
Yeah, I think that... So cards like Helm of the Host, they don't require as much setup as some other like magical Christmas cards might, right?
Yeah.
So Helm of the Host, let's just take a quick peek and remind everyone what this card is actually. Helm of the Host is the artifact, of course, the equipment that it's 4 mana, equips for 5, and it makes a copy of the equipped creature, except it gets haste and it isn't legendary. And it's at the beginning of combat. So all this card requires of your board and of your deck to be relevant is a creature on the board, right?
Yeah.
Now, ideally, you want it to be a really good creature, a legendary creature that will be really abusable, right? But really, it doesn't actually need that to do its thing. So I think like Magical Christmas Land, when you're talking about Helm of the Host, what does it need? One other card? And let's talk about the best case scenario. Let's say we make it like an Elesh Norn. So now your Magical Christmas Land is just you have Helm of the Host and you have Elesh Norn, and you can cast both of them.
Yeah,
you have the mana to do so, right? So like, is that an unrealistic scenario? I don't think so. But if that's what your whole deck is built around, then you might run into problems. And I think that's one of the things we want to talk about. Right now, right here.
Yeah, it's a great... Yeah, so, I mean, Magical Christmas Land is something that can be dangerous if you try to brew around it. Like, your whole deck shouldn't... Just to use the Helm of the Host as an example, would say that, like, oh, my whole deck is about getting Helm of the Host on Elesh Norn. Well, already we can see a lot of flaws in the plan. Like, what if we don't draw Elesh Norn? Okay, fine. What if our opponents destroy Elesh Norn? Okay, fine. So like now if we brewed a deck around it, it would be ways to tutor up Helm of the Host, ways to tutor up Elesh Norn, ways to protect Elesh Norn with like maybe Swiftfoot Boots or Lightning Greaves, something like that. And then a lot of mana ramp so that we can actually attach the Helm of the Host in decent speed to Elesh Norn. And that becomes a lot of work to get 2 cards going. If
Right.
we've brewed our whole deck around that, then I mean, if it works, it's going to be pretty good. No, that's the whole point of it. But that seems unlikely to me.
Well, here's the thing, though, that you kind of maybe unknowingly brought up right there. The things that you're talking about making this work are stuff like Swiftfoot Boots and Greaves, Ramp, and Tutors. I think that everything except for Tutors there is just something decks want to do anyways. So if that is what's leading you to Magical Christmas Land, it no longer becomes this unattainable, super specific thing, and it just kind of becomes you're now building a deck that has good strategy and has the things that you want. Like if your Magical Christmas Land involves putting, it's like, well, I got to put lots of card draw in, and I got to put lots of ramp in, and I got, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're just kind of putting a good like a solid strategy together, right? The Christmas Land part, I think, comes in when there's multiple cards needed, right? So this example of just Helm of the Host and Elesh Norn, like, I don't think it's Magical Christmas Land to build a deck around Helm of the Host's ability. It might be a little bit if we're talking, let's add this other card. Oh, now it's also Elesh Norn. Oh, now it's also, I also want like this other card that really makes it crazy. There's a couple different versions, right? There's this version where you need like 5 cards. That's very difficult. So now your deck is chocked full of tutors. And if your deck is all tutors and one strategy, we've done it. We've even done this on the show before. I think you're going to be disappointed with the results.
Yeah.
Because if any of that part of it is dealt with, then like exiled or whatever, you're going to feel bad. And if then you put in all this stuff, it's like, okay, well, I'll protect it from exile. But then you might draw all the protection and all the other stuff and then not get what you need. And if you're loading it up with tutors, it just becomes this thing where it's like there's not enough redundancy. So one way to avoid Magical Christmas Land, but still wanting to brew around like a crazy fun deck, is to build in a lot of redundancy, build in a lot of ways of like, instead of just protecting the one thing, let's build 4 or 5 different ways of doing that thing, or at least similar things, right? So I wanted to bring up as an example of this, it's a deck we talk about all the time on the show. It's Epic Experiment. So when I started building that deck, when we started talking about that card, it's pure Magical Christmas Land. It's it's Teamer deck. So we built it as a Teamer deck, and I guess there may be a few people who don't know Epic Experiment.
Yeah,
so.
I'm gonna look up while you do that, I'm gonna look up what episode we did it on. So if you want to go back,
that's
and
a good
listen
idea.
to the
Yeah.
episode, yeah.
Okay, so Epic Experiment is the sorcery card. It's X blue red. Exile the top X cards of your library for each instant and sorcery card with converted mana cost X or less. Among them, you may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then put all cards exiled that way. Put all cards exiled this way that weren't cast into your graveyard. So Epic Experiment sets up this crazy scenario that it wants, right? It wants you to have a ton of mana. It wants you to have a high number of instants and sorceries in your deck. And then it wants you to have Epic Experiment and then cast it. It's a lot. It is a lot, right? And one of the reasons this is popular in Commander is because this is hard to get, right? This is tough to get together. And when you do get it together, it feels really great. It feels like you've really accomplished something. And you truly have if you can get this going. So when I put together Epic Experiment, and when we did it on the show,
which is episode 99, by the way.
Ooh, that's the Gretzky episode. Oh my God. I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that ever again. It's the Gretzky. So, and it might be the great one.
Oh, yeah.
So you do need tutors, and you do need a lot of instants and sorceries, and you need a very low number of like permanents, so creatures and things like that. So how are you getting your ramp and all that? These are all problems we face with this deck. But if you can make them all like point in the same direction, then I think you've achieved something. So for our deck, again, go back and listen to episode 99. It's great. And actually, we're going to revisit this deck in the coming weeks and talk about the real life upgrades that I made to it because of we got a suggestion on our Discord channel. Go join Patreon and then you can get in on that channel. And it's a fantastic idea. So I think we're going to do it. But if you look back in that, so all the ramp we got were cards to our hand spells, cheap cards to our hand. So we get a ton of, so the early game is spent getting all these cards, get lands specifically. Then we've included like a bunch of cool, we've included a good number of draw spells, And then a good number of like these big, really like splashy cards like Expropriate and things like that. Although I don't think that's on the show version. That's in the version that I made later because that card's expensive. But stuff like that, you know what I mean? Like big, like 7 and 8 mana, sorcery spells that do crazy things. In the building, I was like, well, this is a one-trick pony. You're gonna hopefully you get Epic Experiment. If you can't, I don't know if the deck really works, right? Because the idea came from us making fun of how bad Epic Experiment was. But then it turned out that because of in building for this Magical Christmas Land, we built in a lot of like redundancy in, not for Epic Experiment because that's a pretty unique card, but there's so much ramp and there was so much other things supporting the idea of having so much instant and sorcery cards in our deck that it all ends up working together. And one thing I'm constantly impressed with, and I'll get into this a bit deeper when we actually do the revisit, but this deck is resilient. Like, you'd think that by exiling Epic Experiment, like let's say countering it with some kind of exile spell like a Dissipate or something, would totally cripple the deck. But that's actually not what happens. Actually, it ends up that even if you don't have your Epic Experiment, if you've ramped enough that now you're in the position to play these big splashy sorcery spells and things like that, and you can copy them and things like that, right? You've got protection for them because there's a couple counter spells in here. It all actually just becomes a strategy as opposed to one crazy like board state that you're trying to achieve, which is what I thought this was, but it ends up not being that.
Right.
And I was surprised by it. And that's why I kind of learned this lesson about Magical Christmas Land.
And so that's a great way to just kind of summarize that whole story, in that like the idea of Magical Christmas Land led to the brewing challenge of like, how do we get there? And we identified some of the faults of like some of the ways to do it, and we just made everything tuned for it. But in doing so, we were including cards that just do what commander decks do anyway, countering spells, drawing cards, ramping. And we ended up with a real deck that sometimes does Epic Experiment and sometimes doesn't. But if it doesn't, the deck still plays. You're still doing things. You're still in the game. Let's go back to that Helm of the Host example, that fictional example we've got there. If we don't need to get Elish Norn with it, but if we just put good ETB creatures and support for that, that'll get us through a game, right? We've got creatures on the board, we're attacking, we're defending, we're getting bonuses from drawing and ETBs and stuff. Like, if we don't get their Helm of the Host, that's fine. We don't necessarily need to. That's the key. So I think one of the takeaways let's remember is when you see an idea for a Magical Christmas Land, let's get excited about that. Let's not look at that as a thing of like, well, maybe that means the card's bad. It's like, no, man, I want that world.
Yeah.
But let's just figure out a way to do that realistically so that the rest of the deck still functions, but that's just a bonus in it, right? That's just part of the deck that can happen, and it's wonderful. I always want to think about like little cards that are sort of Magical Christmas Landy that I think of. Can we talk about Oblivion Sower for 2 seconds? That's a card when I first saw it. It's an Eldrazi card for 6 mana. And it says when you cast it, target opponent exiles the top 4 cards of his or library. Then you put any number of land cards that player owns from exile under the battlefield under your control. In my mind, I'm like, ooh, how can I get 50 lands out of this? I mean, it's only from one player. No one runs 50 lands. But if you are in a deck that already runs a lot of graveyard hate, like your Bojuka Bogs and things like that, it's quite likely that in an average game, most of your opponents have about a dozen lands in exile because graveyards have been exiled. If you've got room, maybe just throw in one Oblivion Sower, because a 6 mana spell that can ramp you by a dozen if you get it to stick, which I've not changed any part of this deck. It's a deck that already exists in my mind. It is fictional in this example, but I can take any deck that I already have that runs plenty of graveyard hate, which most decks should, and just add this one card, and now I get this occasional Christmas Land of like putting 15 lands into play.
Yeah, and I don't know if this might be this is a good example of it. I don't know, like, okay, Oblivion Sower without any other support in it. We're just putting it into a random deck because it's colorless, you can do that. This card will, I think on average, get you 1-0 lands when you play it, right? Without any support.
With no support whatsoever, I think you're right.
So if there's any small amount of support in that, just like even something like what's it called? Slime. The slime that eats cards from graveyards, right? Like that guy. Or any of the cards that are like that, right? Like pinpoint exiling cards, and you can do it more than once. Oblivion Sword gets that like a bit better. I think what you laid out is Magical Christmas Land, what you just said, where you're like, oh, I can get like 6 lands off of this, right?
Well, but that's my point, right?
But, like, so that's the Christmas Land, whereas like the average case for this card, again, with just a tiny amount of support, it's still not bad. It's just that you want to, and as commander players, we want to achieve the heights of the card as opposed to just hitting the average. But you still have to look at that average and say, like, is this something that's going to be helpful? A 6-mana spell that maybe ramps you for 2 or 3 if you have a bit of support. That's not bad.
Yeah, it's not bad. It's not the right, and that's why I say this is an afterthought, as adding a little bit of possible Christmas Land to your existing deck, right? If I have like. Yeah, I mean, not to be repetitive, but like this is a 1-card add that can add the possibility of a Christmas Land. And the payoff is like, yeah, I mean, by adding a random card, you do take away something else your deck is doing. But like I said, I'm only looking at decks that already have support built in. I would never just put this in a random deck. And I think this is an awful way to brew if you're just like, ooh, how can I get Oblivion Sower to get 15 lands every time? So I'm going to do a lot of mill. And then after I mill, I'm going to cast this. I'm going to tutor for this. And it's like, that's now your deck is doing nothing when it doesn't work, right? Yeah.
The idea of looking at it from a brewing perspective and thinking of the best case scenario is going to be in general a dangerous one. There are exceptions to this, and I think that the main exception for our format is when you do this around your commander. And that's kind of the whole point of the commander, is that now you can brew around the commander, right? We can say, okay, well, we know we have access to this card throughout the game. So let's build a Magical Christmas Land that includes that commander. It's like, well, that's an advantage that like we have as brewers over all the other formats of Magic, basically. And the advantages that they get is they're allowed to put 4 cards
right
in their decks, which is arguably better. And
out of 60.
Exactly, and smaller deck sizes. But, we have this one card that we know we're going to be able to use, right? Which is why I never understood people getting upset about the I did at first, but now looking back on it, I'm like, oh, the tuck rule. Okay. People are upset because it's like, well, now people can just build around their commanders. It's like, yeah, that's what we're supposed to do.
That's the whole point of the format.
I thought. Yeah. So, and I get it for like, more competitive, like versions of Commander. It's more of a problem, right? Because there's just no way to deal with this one card that they always have.
Now I have to run more answers.
But like, yeah. So, but for us, we're talking about multiplayer. We're talking about fairly casual stuff here. It's not a problem. It's a good thing. So yeah, that's the kind of exception. So if you're using your commander as part of it, so like if you have Helm of the Host and Alice Norton is your commander, well then that is not Magical Christmas Land. That is just, I'm putting a card in my deck that will work with my commander. And that's why we always say, and it's like one thing I learned pretty early on brewing with commander, is that if there's one card that has nothing to do with any of the other stuff in your deck, but it is like good with your commander, it's worth it.
I think so too.
Like the one that comes to my mind is Illusionist Bracers and Tristani, right?
Sure.
There's Illusionist Bracers is the thing that lets you copy an activated ability if it's equipped to the creature, and Tristani has a tap ability to populate. Well, nothing else in that deck, my version of this, nothing else in that deck has an activated ability on it. No other creatures have it. So literally, Illusionist Bracers only works with Tristani, but it's my commander, so I can always have it, and it's good enough. Like it's basically doubling season for her essentially. That it's good enough and it's worth the include. So it's all about those basic like things that I don't know about you, but like I learned from limited resources, which is like thinking about best case scenario mentality and thinking about the cost, right? The opportunity cost of including cards in your deck and like setup cost. Those are 3 things that contribute to, am I really Am I really thinking of this in terms of Magical Christmas Land, or am I just building a good strategy that will lead me to this Christmas land? Am I building a roadmap to Christmas Land, or am I just thinking I'm going to end up there randomly, you know?
Yeah.
It's all about getting that roadmap together. Build that, like, draw that map to Christmas Land.
Yeah. So okay, Garrett. So in conclusion, let's conclude here. So
let's conclude.
So when you see a card that has cool magical Christmas Land potentials, have that fantasy. Imagine it. See what cards, try to concoct the best case scenarios, and then look at what you've come up with and see if it's possible to build a deck where those cards on their own still do things. Can you build a deck where it's like, yeah, I mean, I'm still going to use my Gray Merchant of Asphodel, Gary. I'm still going to use that in this black and white deck. And maybe Blade of Selves pops up in there, and like maybe I get that to work. But it's like, but it's not all around just getting that to happen. Let's let that be the bonus thing as we go. And if you can, and if it all kind of points towards it, then the likelihood of that happening will get higher. But we're never going to make that the sole focus. Our sole focus is still a solid commander deck.
Yeah, but you know what? But like you're saying, don't be afraid to brew. Like, reach for the skies, man. Go for it, because that's how you That's how you find things that you didn't think were going to work, like Epic Experiment, or like any number of decks we've brewed on this show. We have our fair share of dud decks on this show too, where we're like, this strategy we tried. We put in a million tutors to try and make sure we get this one card, and guess what? It didn't really work. That happens too.
Maybe we take our own advice and rework those and be like, well, let's make them more of a deck and just make this a bonus.
I can't think of any right off the top of my head.
I can. Yeah? I've been toying with one that I want to do in real life, but I'm like, I don't know if it's real, but like maybe this will be it.
A lot of it includes these ones where like your key card is within the deck and it's not your commander. Those are the ones that are the hardest to make work. But you can make them work, certainly. So yeah, love to hear the comments about this down here on YouTube and stuff. And if you want to, like I said, join the Patreon and get in on that Discord chat, we can be talking about this there as well.
Yeah, please put in the comments of like what your magical Christmas Land decks are, and have you ever made them work, or are you still trying to get them to work? Yeah, I want to hear some examples.
Amazing. Okay, well, yeah, good talk.
Big thanks to all our patrons who make these episodes possible.
Yeah, and if you want to check out more comedy videos, check out our Brews News playlist.
Make sure you follow us on Twitch TV to see when we play live.
If you want to chat with us, head over to Twitter. We're at Commanders Brew.
And please hit subscribe to ding the bell and find out when we got new stuff coming out.
See you next time.
Bye.